So my 4 years on the National Security Council staff convinced me that democracies are actually undergoing the first stage of a real-life stress test of their ability to withstand malign influence by high-tech autocracies. Online disinformation is increasingly important and potent as a tool in the arsenal of foreign governments that do not mean us well. And I know that that might seem odd because autocracies are so vastly outnumbered by democracies, but they compensate by marshaling the full resources of their states, by learning from one another how to wield disinformation, and also by coordinating with one another. And one example is just in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, there was a story about how Russia, Iran, and China are waging a coordinated and global disinformation campaign claiming that US COVID vaccines are unsafe and ineffective. So I'd like to dwell for a few minutes on China in particular, because there's really no regime that has more riding on its ability to influence the perceptions and the policies and the priorities of foreign populations, including the US population, than the Chinese Communist Party. So in truth, we probably should have expected this, because the Chinese Communist Party, by its own admission, owes its rise to power in part on its ability to infiltrate and manipulate language, thinking, and actions of its adversaries. And that's why information warfare and what the Chinese Communist Party calls cognitive and psychological warfare are really at the heart of its international strategy. Chinese officials have been taking to Twitter. They've been flooding YouTube as well with and other social media platforms with commentary, slickly produced videos and podcasts, and also ad hominem attacks on people that they perceive to be their foes. And they do this even as those same platforms are universally banned inside of China itself. China has invested billions of dollars into propaganda outlets in virtually every language and country, even as they've banned foreign media and even increasingly a great number of foreign journalists from operating inside of China. They've also redoubled their efforts to conduct covert influence activities around the globe, even as they restrict traditional overt diplomatic activity by foreign diplomats and civic groups inside China's borders. So the Chinese Communist Party calls these activities as a whole, this umbrella of activities, united front work. And China's united front work system is actually a gigantic government function with no analog in Western democracies. Chinese leaders call it a magic weapon, and all of the party's 90 million members are required to support its activities. And while the system has a great many branches, the United Front Work Department by itself has 4 times as many cadres as the United States State Department has foreign service officers. But this isn't diplomacy, right? This is United Front Work is really about gathering intelligence about and then working to influence private citizens overseas, as well as public officials. And they do this by offering inducements to people that the party finds useful to their goals, such as, for example, scientists who have access to cutting-edge technology. But they also act to isolate people that they find troublesome through relentless online attacks as one means of doing that. So United Front workers are a bit of a platypus. You know, they're a cross between an intelligence officer, a propagandist, and a psychologist. And it's sort of a funny image to think about, but it really shouldn't be underestimated, because the raw material for psychologists is data about their patients. And the Chinese government is compiling digital dossiers on millions and millions of foreign citizens around the world. And the exposure last year of a Chinese database, the accidental leakage of a Chinese database of at least 2.4 million people around the world speaks to the ambition of China's effort. And that was just one database by one Chinese company. But those databases and dossiers in them included people in virtually every country on earth, no matter how small. They included members of royal families and members of parliament, judges, down to clerks, tech mavens, budding entrepreneurs, 4-star admirals, crew members of warships in the US Navy, professors and think tankers and national as well as local officials in foreign countries. And they also include children who are not off limits under Beijing's rules of political warfare. So no one is too prominent, no one is too obscure to be of interest. And assembling dossiers has always been a feature of Leninist regimes. But what's new is how easy we've made it for autocratic regimes to accumulate so much intimate data about ourselves. The smartphones that we use all day to chat, to search, to tweet, buy, view, bank, navigate, and network, as well as worship and confide, make our thoughts and our actions quite plain to cyber spooks and really leave our lives open like open books. What's also new is the potential through social media platforms for these autocratic governments to reach and influence broad swaths of our society. And Chinese officials, just like Russian security services, pay very close attention to the most inflammatory and the most divisive issues that are trending online here and around the world. And they seek to deepen those divisions, as well as manipulate them to their advantage and even to sow doubt about the viability of democracy itself. That's a recurring meme in Chinese disinformation campaigns and propaganda campaigns. It's that democracy doesn't work, it's not sustainable, and is ultimately doomed. So in a way, we're all complicit in a way in making ourselves and our open society easier targets for this kind of foreign disinformation. And that's because of the tenor of our social media discourse here in the United States. It's incredibly negative to begin with, even before you introduce disinformation from abroad. And social media algorithms push stories and posts that reaffirm our biases and that also fuel regular and highly unproductive peaks of outrage. I mean, you think about how much time people spend feeling outraged by what they're reading on their various social media posts. So anger, pride, intolerance are all featured in ample supply on your average social media feed. I read just the other day a provocative and very well-written article called "The Spectre of Totalitarianism," which appeared this month in a new or a resurrected UK publication called The Critic. And the author, Edward Skidelsky, argues that intolerance opens the door to a totalitarian mindset that he argues is already creeping into our culture. And he writes that, quote, tolerance in the classical liberal sense involves the simultaneous affirmation of two propositions: that one, an idea or a practice is wrong, and two, that it still has a right to exist. And so when we look at things like cancel culture, which abounds online, and I dare say on many college campuses as well, the focus of cancel culture is on the first part, that an idea is wrong, but it completely ignores the second part of the idea of tolerance in a liberal democratic sense, where we affirm that an idea, even one that we think is wrong, still has a right to exist and to be discussed. So I wanted to close with a modest proposal for reintroducing a greater measure of tolerance in our public debate. And it starts with a very Mike Mansfield style allegiance to this notion of civility. So the idea is to adopt a simple code in how we conduct ourselves when we're arguing online or in the real world. And the code has three principles, just three simple principles. One, refrain from making ad hominem attacks on your opponent. That is, attack your opponent's argument, but don't attack the person making the argument. Second, refrain from ascribing evil motives to your opponent. In fact, you should really try to give your opponent the benefit of the doubt that their motive for holding a certain belief is well intended, even if you disagree with it. And third and finally, use your real name, or if you use a handle online, at least make sure that your real name is discoverable relatively easily. So people tend to make, take slightly greater care in the comments that they make when they know that they own them. And in the days before social media, it was very rare for newspaper editors to publish anonymous letters. And that's because readers demand a degree of accountability from those people that they're reading. So the second part and final part of my proposal, if you'll bear with me, is actually for the social media platforms themselves to permit people who adhere voluntarily to switch their accounts over to a civility mode. That they would permit people to sort of operate in the civility mode. And in civility mode, only posts that adhere to those three principles I mentioned: no ad hominem attacks, no ascribing evil motives to contributors, and no complete anonymity. And so posts in civility mode that adhere to those three principles would appear in people's feeds. If a post doesn't meet any of those three principles, it just gets regulated to the regular feed, which you might call sewer mode. So you've got civility mode and sewer mode. So I'm still working out the details, and I'll send a proposal to Jack Dorsey at Twitter and Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook soon. But again, the idea is voluntary. No one gets canceled from a platform altogether for failing to be civil. It's just that their uncivil discourse isn't going to be seen by those people who want to read civil discourse only. And it also doesn't involve that nettlesome matter of trying to be the arbiter of what's true and what's untrue, or canceling what's deemed by a platform or a person to be untrue. That's really sticky business. There are objective truths and there are subjective truths, but I think the truths that we all hold most dearly are usually a bit of both. Our faith and our ideals certainly fall into that category of a mix of subjectivity and objectivity. So a good measure of civility, I think, would make it harder as well for China, Russia, Iran, and other regimes that are hostile to liberal democracy to inflict so much harm on us through their information warfare. And as Mike Mansfield would have said, civility is also a good act of citizenship. And so thanks very much, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Matt, for that very thought-provoking, interesting address, and alarming as well, I should say, in many ways. As you explained so well, we're facing a formidable challenge in both disinformation from abroad, from countries like China, and also here at home. You mentioned the coordinated campaign by China, the Soviet, Russia, and others to denigrate our vaccines. I can't help but thinking about the COVID deniers we have here in our own country, and the very prominent role they've had at one of our top cable news networks, which I would argue has also played a tremendously important role in disinformation here, affecting all of us here in the United States. So my question for you is, what practical steps can be taken by the US government, but also clearly by our big social media companies, which are integral to any sort of solution to the scourge of disinformation, and also our media as well, to try to deal with this tremendous onslaught of disinformation, which is so damaging to our social cohesion and our country as a whole.
Yeah, no, I think there are several things that have to be done, and the media has to reassert itself in the role of being a dispassionate, relatively objective. I mean, everyone has biases. Newspapers and newspaper reporters have them, but making an effort to be fair as well as skeptical of all points of view that are being presented. That's the role that should be the role of the media, right? It's presenting, not just becoming a channel for bile that dominates either the cable news channels or social media feeds, but taking a step back from that and making an attempt to weigh and assess different points of view, to actually present different points of view, even if the reporter doesn't subscribe to one of those points of view. That's one part of it. Second, I mean, the idea of I've thought a bit about this idea of, trying to determine what's disinformation and what's not. And like I mentioned in my remarks, I think this is really, really sticky business because so much is subjective in what we hold to be dear and true. And that's why I think the idea of approaching it first through civility. I mean, in sort of the golden age of newspaper journalism, before the internet really took off, but after earlier periods of more sloppy tabloid journalism, you had this golden period that Tiff, you and I were lucky enough to sort of surf the final decade of. When the financial model worked well enough that you could actually fund really high quality journalism and high standards, you would never have seen the kind of discourse in newspapers that you see just routinely on cable news and on social media. You would see a much higher quality of discourse, including on the editorial page where you've got different points of view. And I've always recommended that people subscribe to at least one publication that holds kind of an incongruent view, even the opposite political view of where you feel comfortable. I practice that here at home, just to challenge, especially with high quality publications, to challenge your thinking about some of those ideas and to foster a stronger sense of civility and a sense of community. Just the sense that even people who have different political views are still fundamentally Americans. But it's sticky business. I don't think that doing nothing is going to get us there or save us. I feel like we're flying in clouds right now, and we're headed towards a mountain, and level steady flight is going to crash us into a mountain. So there are steps that have to be taken, but they've got to be taken with a liberal, with a small L point of view, a liberal, democratic, classical liberal point of view that entertains and is tolerant of ideas that we don't like.
Mm-hmm. So shifting direction a little bit here to the larger foreign policy relationship between the U.S. and China, the Trump administration, which you served in, has been given credit, and I think rightly so, for carrying out an overdue rethinking of our relationship with China, focusing more on the places where we do have real challenges, whether it be practices of cyber espionage or the mercantilist trade policies carried out so brazenly by China. At the same time, many people have said that under Trump, some of our closest relations with our closest allies, including in Asia and in Europe, have been damaged. And that has made it more difficult for us to meet the challenge of a rising China. First of all, I'm interested in what your response is to that criticism. I'm wondering what you think about the Biden administration's now much professed plan to rebuild relations with allies, even as they continue to take a tough stance towards China. Are there any pitfalls in trying to simultaneously rebuild all those relationships while continuing to confront China? And I'm also interested in what you think about what appears to be, with the new administration, an emphasis on turning to the so-called Quad, which, as you well know, the strategic grouping, which includes the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the media focused on President Trump's, tough rhetoric, but towards European allies in particular. His view that we're being taken advantage of, and that Europeans need to share a much larger shoulder or share of the burden of Europe's defense, for example. The United States accounts for 70% of the defense spending for Europe's defense, even though Europe's economy is, comparable. But in fact, I would challenge the assertion that the relationships in Asia were damaged. That's not what Asian leaders themselves expressed to us. The government of Japan expressed that they thought that the approach that we took, the fact that we were willing to impose costs on China and to drive a hard line, was to their minds something that helped enhance the relationship and the alliance. We heard great things from Vietnam, from Taiwan, certainly from India, where we had a real breakthrough during the Trump administration in both bilateral ties, but also, as you referred to, in quadrilateral ties. Remember the Quad, this idea that was really put forth first by the Japanese Prime Minister Abe, more than a decade ago, that you would have a natural grouping in the Indo-Pacific region between the great democracies, India to the west, America to the east, Australia to the south, and Japan to the north, almost a diamond. He used to describe it as a diamond. That concept was always very, very appealing, but never got off the ground because either India got cold feet or the Australians would get cold feet. Under the last administration, we were able to push that concept to take flight. And we ended up having, for the first time in its history, 2 cabinet-level meetings among the Quad members and a whole host of sub-cabinet-level meetings, including, at my level, deputy national security advisors. We had regular video teleconferences, classified video teleconferences, where we talked about our common agenda for rebuilding our economies post-COVID, diversifying our supply chains, pushing back against disinformation by autocratic governments, including China. And so what you're going to see now is, as that's taken flight, the next logical step that I'm very encouraged to see that the Biden administration is going to take, according to news reports, will be a summit-level meeting among those Quad leaders. That's a really important breakthrough. It provides a natural sort of counterweight to the Chinese strategy, which is to build, rather than have a collection of co-equal sovereign countries. The Chinese strategy is to build a hierarchical, almost imperial in some ways, Sinocentric sphere of influence in Asia. And so the Quad is one grouping that can help counterbalance and prevent that kind of an outcome that would erode sovereignty and independence and ultimately the prosperity and security of countries along China's periphery.
When we look at Asia today, it seems as if we see conflict everywhere, from some of the issues we've seen in the South China Sea to the Indian-Chinese mini skirmishes where people have died in the Himalaya, to the Senkaku Islands near Japan, and of course, Taiwan. I'm interested, when you look at the region, given all your experience, what are you really the most concerned about? And what do you think, therefore, the U.S. government should really, I'm sure she should be focusing on everything, but what do we really need to focus in on now as potentially the real flashpoint, which could spark a real confrontation between the U.S. and China?
Yeah, I think one flashpoint is China itself, meaning just internally. If you look at the steps that China has taken, especially in the past couple of years, starting at least since 2017, the archipelago of concentration camps, forced labor camps in Xinjiang, where they're interning ethnic and religious minority groups. I think you've seen that the Biden administration reaffirmed the Trump administration's determination that a genocide is taking place in Xinjiang. Just overnight, I saw that there was a group of international NGOs and legal scholars that weighed all of the available evidence about what's happening in Xinjiang and found that every single provision of the UN Charter on Genocide has been violated. In other words, satisfies a definition that genocide is taking place in China. And we've seen the Canadian Parliament reaffirm this, the Dutch Parliament. So there's a growing recognition that a genocide is taking place inside China's borders. Also last year, China determined that it did not want to live up to its international treaty with Great Britain, which it had registered at the United Nations, to honor a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong for 50 years, all the way through 2047. They called that short half roughly, and have moved to undermine the rule of law, democracy. They've been jailing opposition politicians, just democracy politicians, under a vague subversion law. You have the situation that you mentioned where China's leader seems to want to make his legacy annexing Taiwan by force if necessary. And it's hard to imagine any other way that they would be able to annex Taiwan, given what a distressing proposition it is for Taiwan people to be to imagine being ruled by Beijing at a moment when there's a genocide and the destruction of Hong Kong taking place. So these are not the actions of a confident government. These are the actions of a highly paranoid government that fears above all, and fears well above its fear of the United States, really its own people. It fears its own people first. If you look at the amount of money that China spends on its internal surveillance and its internal security, it now significantly outweighs the amount of money that they spend on their military. And by the way, the military sometimes gets called in to participate in repression of the local population, the domestic civilian population, as we saw back in 1989 with the massacre of students around Tiananmen Square. So I actually think that the inherent weakness of China's system is itself a potential flashpoint.
You mentioned Xi Jinping, who, of course, plays an outsized role in so much of what concerns us about China today, whether it's the economy, politics, military, and so on. Recently, we saw the publication of an anonymously authored piece on U.S. relations with China called The Longer Telegram, which, of course, you are familiar with. Amongst its various proposals, one was that we should think about turning our efforts towards focusing on the eventual stepping down or removal of General Secretary Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
And sort of the implicit suggestion was, I think it was relatively implicit, was that there are potentially reformers waiting in the wings within the Chinese Communist Party who would be potentially far more amenable to having a better relationship on terms that both sides could agree on. I'm wondering what you think of that particular proposition, focusing on Xi Jinping as the real target of the problems that we face in China.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. I did read that that anonymous longer telegram. I thought it was a useful document. It had good sections on how Beijing sees the world and the aggressive, really relentless threat that it poses to democracy globally. That was a very clear assumption made by whoever the author was of that document. I don't know who wrote it. It explores Beijing's vulnerabilities as well, which I think is always useful. U.S. and European policymakers too often forget to bear in mind all the inherent weaknesses of Beijing's model. But I think the analyst or the author or authors tied themselves in knots with some of the policy recommendations that were made. The most problematic objective that they laid out, I think, was the idea that the U.S. Must make its foremost objective, however they phrase it, convincing the Chinese Communist Party to support a U.S.-led liberal international order and not build an autocratic alternative to that. But that is a very unrealistic goal. That's really what we're trying to do with 30 years of failed policy before 2017. It's like telling the Communist Party to stop being a Leninist single party regime. In a way, it's the way that Beijing reads that proposition is actually some form of regime change, and so I just find that unrealistic. It's like saying our foremost goal is to train a great white shark to become a bottlenose dolphin. It's like it defies the laws of nature. You can't do that. And so we should have more realistic goals in mind. The idea that we should that the author of that put forward that you should criticize mainly Xi Jinping but not the party as a whole. I think I know what they're after. I don't think that it's realistic that we would be able to cleave away Xi Jinping from the rest of the party. He is, to my mind, and even I think the author of that report even said it himself, said that Xi Jinping is actually representing the grand strategy and aspirations that the Chinese Communist Party has held for a long time. It's simply that he's accelerated them and taken some rather draconian steps to implement a totalitarian surveillance system using high technology and so forth, in ways that do mark a departure from Deng Xiaoping's era. But my view is that there should be costs associated with being a member of the Chinese Communist Party. If you're a member of that party, it means that you are partly responsible for the shame of the Chinese nation, which is this genocide that's taking place. I don't think that those actions are representative of the Chinese people. They're not representative of the Chinese nation, but they are representative of the Chinese Communist Party. And so I do think that there should be. I don't think we should be timid about criticizing the party or its ideology or its horrific atrocities that it's committing.
Multinationals, changing gears a bit again. Multinationals, including some of our very biggest American companies, are facing pressures in China today. They are attacked by the Chinese government and pilloried in the Chinese social media for references that seem somehow to support Taiwan or Hong Kong as defined by the party. Very harmless things like posting Taiwan on the website in a way that somehow suggests that it is separate from China. In most cases, those companies react, of course, by apologizing and issuing statements to the Chinese government and the Chinese people, apologizing for this grievous mistake they've made. Perhaps more seriously, we are seeing efforts by the government and the Chinese Communist Party to establish Communist Party cells in the China operations of some of our companies as well. Yeah. At the same time, we see multinationals showing very little hesitation about turning a blind eye to things like human rights abuses. We've seen many examples of companies, including our own, that are directly or indirectly doing business, for example, in Xinjiang, which, as you just mentioned, is the site of one of the worst human rights tragedies now unfolding in the world, with the persecution of the ethnic minority Muslim, mainly Uyghurs. We've also seen a number of U.S. companies that have helped support by selling services and products, help support the rise of the Chinese surveillance state. So my question for you is, what role do you think the government has in supporting our companies as they start to confront some of these challenges or demands from the Chinese government that we may not think are appropriate for them to bend to? And at the same time, what is the role of the government here in the U.S. and also the people, the society as a whole, in policing or trying to influence the behavior of those of our companies that are involved in business practices or in parts of China or in businesses in China that really run counter to the values that we hold here?
Yeah, no, this Beijing, to all the examples you've just given, I think are emblematic of a very deliberate policy by Beijing now to force American businesses to choose. They can either represent U.S. values and democratic norms, or they can do business in China and leave all of that behind. And when I say leave it behind, that doesn't just mean maintain your values when you're home. It means that China increasingly does not want those companies exemplifying those values even in other parts of the world, because again, that paranoid mindset of the party, a communist party that lives in a state of almost catastrophic anxiety that everything could fly apart at any moment, and that it could lose its grip on power because it knows that it doesn't have fundamental legitimacy with its own people. Increasingly, they're saying you have to choose. You either have to live by our rules and norms, which means shut your mouths about things like a genocide in Xinjiang, or the threat of war with Taiwan, or the undermining of the rule of law and democracy in Hong Kong. You can either keep your mouth shut about that, or you can forget about having any access to the Chinese market. And so at the same time that that's happening, with the Trump administration, and now with I think a significant degree of continuity in the early policy declarations of the Biden administration on China policy, what you're seeing is a hardening of a consensus in Washington, bipartisan consensus, bicameral. It's executive as well as legislative. You have this consensus that the U.S. has to take significant steps now to push back against China's aggression and its attempts to interfere in our democracies. And so U.S. business leaders increasingly look like sailors who are trying to straddle two boats. And when you try to do that, there's a high probability that you're going to get wet. And so I think U.S. CEOs are only beginning to wake up to the very different geostrategic realities that have come to the fore over the last 4 years, and which I think are going to continue with President Biden's policy. I read his interim strategic guidance, which was fairly strong on and consistent, I think, with that bipartisan consensus that I'm describing. I think that these CEOs have not woken up to the fact that they're now standing in the middle of a landmine, and in every direction they're facing regulatory risk, they're facing reputational risk related to China's human rights violations, fiduciary risk given the fact that the U.S. government is trying to rein in American investment that has been flowing passively into Chinese military-backed companies, and also some of the worst human rights violating companies that are complicit in the apartheid state that's being set up in Xinjiang. So if I were a CEO, I'd be working very hard to try to educate myself on this new geostrategic reality, and I'd be doing a lot more careful risk assessment for all those factors, and also for their supply chains. Beijing's stated grand strategy is to control supply chains for high tech globally. They want to be able to exert that leverage, that economic leverage, to achieve political gains. So we're living in a different place from where we were several years ago, and I think that the American business community is only vaguely becoming aware of the very different world that they're now operating in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'd like to turn to some of our audience questions, which are very good. First, you mentioned in your Meet the Press interview that the Chinese Communist Party did not turn to their CDC, Center for Disease Control, to deal with this crisis, the pandemic. They turned to their military. Could you expand on what exactly you mean by that and how the Chinese military was involved?
Yeah, so when the pandemic began, it began as an outbreak in Wuhan sometime in the fall of 2019. Certainly November is when most epidemiologists believe that it was certainly no later than November that this first began. The first confirmed cases were, for example, December 1st, people who were turning up at hospitals and so forth. The head of the Chinese CDC who is a well-regarded, well-trained scientist who had actually spent years in the United States working at our CDC, had a close working relationship with members of the U.S. CDC team in Atlanta, and as well as at our embassy in Beijing. He was not informed, according to a Wall Street Journal report that came out over the summer. He didn't know until the end of December. So at least, weeks after this outbreak began, authorities waited until then to actually inform him that it happened. And then it was another 19 or 20 days. It was January 19th, before he was even permitted to visit Wuhan. The head of the Chinese CDC was not permitted to visit Wuhan until the day before they shut down the city, and that was actually months into the outbreak. What China did do was send the head of its biological warfare program from the PLA to go take over that laboratory and to help coordinate the overall effort. So I've heard there's been some speculation that, well, maybe it's just that only the local government knew and they didn't want the central government to know. We now know that that's false. We know the central government, at the party at least, was aware and was actively involved in the effort to silence citizen journalists as well as doctors who first raised the alarm, including Dr. Li Wenliang, who raised the alarm, was one of the earliest doctors to raise the alarm about this new strain of a dangerous respiratory disease that was spreading. The central government propaganda apparatus at the beginning of January ran national news broadcasts attacking Dr. Li Wenliang as a rumor monger and making clear that people need to shut their mouths and that they're going to be prosecuted by the Chinese Public Security Bureau if they talk about things like a circulating virus. So you'll notice that in January, the State Department put out a fact sheet that also asserted that the Chinese military has been involved in animal and other experimental research on viruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology going back several years. That's a fact that has not been ever confirmed or acknowledged by the Chinese government. We know it's true, and the Washington Post yesterday reported that the Biden administration has asserted the facts that were laid out in that fact sheet as being accurate. In other words, that was a very carefully crafted fact sheet. The Biden administration asserts as well that those are the facts in that sheet are true. But I also want to caution that doesn't mean that this necessarily came out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It is possible that this was a naturally occurring virus that jumped from animals to human beings. We don't know for sure. We probably won't know because the Chinese Communist Party has made it very, very hard for us to gather any of the information that would allow us to eliminate either possibility. So I'm in the camp, along with a growing number of scientists, including a number of scientists who wrote a recent open letter to the World Health Organization. I'm of the view that it is very much possible that this did emerge from the laboratory, and that the effort undertaken by Beijing and by the WHO is wholly insufficient, completely insufficient, as far as a credible investigation would go that would be able to prove one way or the other where this thing actually originated.
That was, I think, another part of the Face the Nation interview that certainly got a lot of attention, and that was you saying that you did. I don't want to misphrase or misquote you, but saying that the preponderance of evidence suggested to you that it was the source of the pandemic was a lab leak.
Yeah, well, the evidence is circumstantial. There's a advisor to the WHO who was a Clinton administration National Security Council official named Jamie Metzel, who keeps a running tally on his weblog of all of the circumstantial evidence in support of the possibility that this emerged from a laboratory. It's an extremely compelling, lengthy list of bullet points. The bullet points on the other side of the ledger that this came naturally is actually quite short. In fact, some of the early leads that led to speculation that this occurred naturally have since been ruled out. For example, the Huanan seafood market across the street from one of the Wuhan labs, the Wuhan CDC lab, and just a couple kilometers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Even the Chinese CDC has ruled out that was the source of this virus. So in some ways, there's a shrinking list of circumstantial evidence for the natural emergence hypothesis, and a growing number of bullet points, circumstantial, in support of a lab accident as being the source of this pandemic.
Okay.
By the way, there were numerous laboratory accidents in some of China's most prestigious laboratories that led to death from other viruses, including the SARS virus from 2003. The Beijing Center for Disease Control accidentally leaked that virus. It led to multiple infections and a fatality. There were 3 other leaks of that virus from that and other Chinese laboratories that claimed to have very good safety practices in place. And by the way, these kinds of outbreaks have occurred in the United States as well throughout our history. The New York Magazine a few months ago wrote a lengthy piece in their Intelligencer section that goes through the history of laboratory accidents and makes its own circumstantial case for this probably having been a accidental lab leak. I'd refer you to that article. I thought they did a good job of sort of exploring that history. These labs are not infallible. Human beings are not infallible. The kind of research that they were doing is cutting edge. It is gain of function research where you genetically alter mice so that they have human lungs, humanized lungs, not natural mice lungs, but lungs that can contain the same receptors that human lungs have. And then they drive wild caught and also laboratory experimental viruses through those models to try to understand how those viruses and the components of those viruses might react in human lungs. The purpose of this, of course, is to try to understand how to defend against a future pandemic. But it's possible that in doing that research, scientists could accidentally actually seed the kind of pandemic that their research was designed to avoid in the first place.